welcome everybody to this last session in our Entrepreneurial State Festival series. So if you're interested in other talks and discussions in this series, you can go on our website. There is, I think, 7 more talks. And yeah, so this is our last in this session. So Entrepreneurial State Festival is celebrating the 10th anniversary of the book, Entrepreneurial State, published by our director and founder, Mariana Mazzucato, 10 years ago exactly. And the Institute itself was founded 5 years ago. So we have this nice reasons to celebrate both the book and the Institute as well. And as I'm sure many of you have joined us today, you know the main sort of the idea of Entrepreneurial State, the book, and that looked at how the technology investments by particularly the US government led to this massive technological changes and revolutions in form of digital revolutions, iPhones, all the nice things that we're now actually enjoying. And that was mainly the point of the book, was that this main sort of key innovations come about from this sort of co-production between government investment, leading the way, paving the way for not only in basic science, but also in development, like the moonshot mission, and the like, and then private sector being the partner in terms of diffusing many of those innovations throughout the economy and society. And of course, what is really interesting in that book is that it also, of course, discusses the role of bureaucracy, and in this case, a very particular bureaucracy, which was around DARPA, which is the US Agency for Defense Research and Innovation, of course. And what is really interesting, of course, about that is because it's a very non-traditional agency. It's a very flat hierarchy. It's a very agile agency, and it's very non-traditional and focused on risk-taking, finding out whether certain technologies and solutions work or not. So this was the sort of the original entrepreneurial state. At the core of that is this very agile bureaucracy, if you will. And at the same time, of course, we know from public administration research and the development studies, particularly, that what very often works is actually much more traditional, stability-focused bureaucracy that provides for this long-term strategic goal setting in terms of building up infrastructure, building even civil service infrastructure, all of those things. So it seems to be very different kind of entrepreneurial state, right? So if you think about East Asian development, but also even the European history of European governments is very much focusing on what we call Weberian bureaucratic institutions of civil service and very much around predictability and stability and expertise, of course, as well. And I think what we have, so it's like almost these 2 different types of entrepreneurial states that seems to be very, very successful over time. And I think in 2000, in the last 20 years, we have seen emergence of all kinds of new ideas around how do we make more of an entrepreneurial state, or more creative and more innovative state, very much around the public sector innovation discourse, but also design, strategic design, agility from the digital government initiative or digital agency. So there's all kinds of new initiatives popping up, and governments are much more, at least in rhetoric, they're trying to be more experimental. And of course, Kai Bieders, one of our panelists, already wrote in 1994 that reform ways we call new public management were actually misdiagnosing the problem in terms of not focusing on the innovative functions of the higher levels of civil service and governments, but actually rather focusing on this, efficiency in public service delivery. And I think he has been prophetically proven right in that sense. So we are very, very grateful to have him here on the panel today with us. So I think what we try to do today is, particularly when we look at this emerging focus of governments to be more purposeful around solving challenges like sustainable development goals are providing us with around sustainability, I think there's really the question we want to discuss today around is, what does it mean to have this kind of more creative entrepreneurial government when we are actually living in the times of climate emergency? Can we even have this sort of a neutrality-focused civil service that is supposed to be politically neutral when we actually have to follow climate emergency and much more inclusive growth-oriented goals as well? So I think this is what we're trying to do today. And of course, this is something that there is increasingly a lot of attention is being not only paid to policies, but also increasingly organizations, bureaucracies, and how civil service works. And so this is what we try to do today, and I'm joined by excellent panelists. And so I'll do a brief introduction to the panel before each of the panelists has a a 8 to 10 minute block to give their views. If you want to go less, that's also fine. So, and after that, we are very keen to take questions and comments from the audience as well. And it should take us, until 7 p.m. UK time, and so a bit more than an hour. So on the panel today, we have, and I think I start with the order of appearance on the panel as well. So, so we have Michelle Pawson, who was in the middle of my screen. I don't know which way you see her, but good morning, Michelle. I know it's incredibly early for you, so we are very grateful that you join us today from New Zealand. And Michelle is, among other things, she's at the moment also policy fellow at IIPP, but she works in her everyday life, as it were, as a principal policy advisor for New Zealand's Productivity Commission on an inquiry into rethinking New Zealand's public management systems to address persistent disadvantage. And as I said, she's also a policy fellow at IIPP, and she has, of course, a long-term background in working at New Zealand civil servants. Then we have Gabriela Gomez-Mont joining us today from Bogota. And again, Gabriela is also affiliated with IIPP. She's a visiting professor of practice here. But in the real life, Gabriela is the founder and CEO of Experimentalista, which is a novel type of nomadic and creative office specialized in cities. And she has also worked as a chief creative officer in Mexico City and in other places. And she very much focuses on these new experimental practices in cities particularly, but also works with national governments and again, increasingly in Latin America. I'm sure she will talk about her experiences there. So, and we have also Kai Peters, who is a Morris Fall Professor of Government at the University of Pittsburgh. And as I already mentioned briefly, Kai is one of those key academics in public administration. I think technically you are the most cited public administration scholar today in the world. So a very eminent public administration scholar and has been writing about these issues for a very long time. And so I'm very happy that you could join us as well. And as I said, we have a fourth panel member who's stuck in the UK border guard at the moment, and he's Aaron Manyam. I'm sure he'll join us in time because he has been texting me. And Aaron is formerly a senior civil servant from Singapore government and has very recently joined Blavatnik School at Oxford. And he focuses both in his practical and in his academic life on digital government and technology. But he's also an award-winning poet, so I'm sure we will have excellent interventions from some of one of the airports in London. So that's it from my side. And as I said, we have interventions from the panelists, and then we'll have, let's see whether we get the debate. But I don't think the debate today is really the core of the idea. I think we are bringing the various viewpoints in the middle of the floor here and seeing from very various perspectives what is going on with civil service, what is going on with bureaucracy, and how are they actually relating to the Sustainable Development Goals and climate emergency in particular. So we will see where we get to. And again, for the audience, if you have questions, comments, please keep them coming in the Q&A function, and we'll get to them in a minute. So I think, Michelle, so we want to honor your getting up very early for us. So you can go first.
Thank you, Rainer. So I guess I'm coming more at this from a public policy practitioner experience, rather than from an academic experience. And so, and as Rainer said, I've been working on, various public policy pieces over my 20-year career, and more recently, looking at kind of persistent disadvantage with the Productivity Commission. So I just wanted to start by kind of just kind of focusing on the fact that I think these international commitments like the SDGs are actually really important. So for New Zealand, I grew up in the shadow, I guess, of the CFC, so ozone depletion, which led to the Montreal Protocol. And it was quite interesting see that as a really successful kind of international commitment device. And I guess as what Rain is saying is, how do we look at the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, kind of, at a midpoint, and think about them in the context of, the climate emergency. And so from my perspective, when I think about the Sustainable Development Goals in New Zealand, so recently, the Auditor General, so a function within the New Zealand Civil Service, looked and did a review of the Sustainable Development Goals here and looked at their implementation. And what they found was that New Zealand is struggling to implement these. And so largely that focuses on kind of a lack of clear leadership around who's responsible for this at a domestic level, and also kind of no consolidated plan or kind of a function to monitor progress, and a need to set up appropriate governance. And so I think what this comes back to in my mind is the importance of these international commitments, but the need for commitment devices and an ability to translate them at a domestic level clearly, with clear responsibilities. So I think if you look across a number of the environmental and social policy issues, what you see in the public services is you see a lot of barriers to change, or you see siloism, you see fragmentation, and in places like New Zealand, which have a history of colonization, you also see the ongoing impacts of colonization and discrimination. So for me, there's something about what's the intent, what are the mindsets, and what are the values and the assumptions in this. And so I think one thing that we've been looking at is what does sustainable development mean? Is this a broad enough kind of frame, or is this are the assumptions and the values in this broad enough to actually capture kind of non-material well-being? So New Zealand has kind of gone down the path of looking at kind of living standards framework and what well-being means in a broader sense, and this is work that's been led by the Treasury and others, and so that's kind of looking at what does it mean to honour Te Tiriti, which is the treaty that New Zealand has with Maori as an Indigenous people, and what does it mean to bring those broader non-material values into this kind of development frame, and where does that take you, and how do you kind of think about that? And yeah, so I guess it is a struggle to try and work out what you prioritize and then what the frameworks are that you kind of look through. But recently, in the work that I've been doing, we've been looking at where New Zealand is at, and what we're finding is that actually through a Treasury Wellbeing Review, through the Productivity Commission, look at poverty that we've done, and then also through the Environmental Synthesis report that the Ministry for the Environment's done, that actually we have increasing inequality, and there is a real concern here that future generations are going to be worse off. And I think some of this is that we're suffering from the overpromise of sustainable development, and particularly as an economy that is based on kind of on the primary sector and the impacts that farming has had from a broader environmental perspective. So I think it's easy to look to countries like New Zealand and other places and think that we're doing well, and we are on a global stage, but I think it's also important to not kind of sit on your laurels or become complacent about where you are, and to really kind of think about the things that Rain has been talking about. What does it mean to kind of look for change, or to what does it mean to innovate and to experiment? And so some of the work that I've been doing has been looking at what does it mean to make explicit the values and the assumptions that you hold in the public policy landscape. And if you make those explicit, then that enables you to be able to interrogate them, but also it enables you to start thinking about what kind of innovations you need, and how you kind of look at kind of having these broader conversations about where you need to get to, and particularly around accountability and responsibility, and kind of shifting from a cost burden perspective to more of a conversation about risks, so the ongoing risks for future generations as well.
Thank you very much for this, Michelle. And yeah, I think just to follow up quickly, I think there is this, as you mentioned, also that New Zealand is quite well known today around this well-being agenda and things like that. And I think similar to Finland, somewhat, I think a lot of countries are looking at New Zealand and Finland as one of those forerunners in this agenda, trying to move beyond GDP and growth agendas. And so how would you evaluate how easy or difficult it is to translate these kind of agendas into the everyday workings of government bureaucracies, really?
Yeah, I guess it's so we've made a really good crack at it. Like there's a really good start, but I think what we've found in this inquiry, and I can share that in the chat, is actually it is one thing to kind of stand up the frameworks or the foundations, and it's another thing to actually go deeper and embed that into the decision making in the system, but also the mindsets and the kind of narratives of the conversations you're trying to have. So we have a living standards framework which has a lot of metrics, but not all of those are populated, and also the government doesn't necessarily collect data for all of those things. And so I think it is hard to go past GDP, but even productivity is it's a metric, right? So it's easy to hold that, but well-being is a deeper, bigger concept. And so what does that mean? And I think it also comes into the perspective of different people, so what well-being means for one person might be different from another. And so the work that we've done is actually looking at, well, what would it mean if you actually looked at recreating the social contract that we have, re-exploring that work that Hillary and others have done in the UK, and if you started to push into some of Kate Raworth's thinking, and what would it actually mean in practice to create a social floor and to have an environmental ceiling, and if your social floor was about more than income adequacy, what would that mean? And so I think that some of these aspects are probably a really good way to, in a contemporary context, to actually translate some of the intent of the SDGs into practice and to actually see that working, but that is, this is hard, because especially if you have a dominant economic paradigm within your system, which is really focused on efficiency, then it is more difficult to bring in different metrics and different frameworks which have more uncertainty in them. And so I think one of the key things is making sure that, the decision-making filters that your thinking goes through are actually set with the intent of what you're trying to achieve. And so one of the things that we've been finding in New Zealand, so New Zealand actually has some of the highest discounting rates in the OECD. And so, we're actually discounting our social policy and environmental decision-making more than others. And so, no wonder we are struggling to make long-term commitments to, things like electrification and things like that.
Thank you so much for now. And I'm sure maybe Kai might come back and mention New Zealand as well as one of the original sort of new public management reform countries as well. So it's a kind of a full circle maybe here today. But yeah, Gabriela, coming to you. So you have come from in that sense from a quite different perspective. At the same time, also really interested in in different perspectives on how do we actually develop public services, and what does it mean to run a city government in a different way, focusing on citizen needs and things like that. So and welcome, Aaron. Glad to see you. You joined. You can join us. So I have told people of your troubles with water.
Yes. Including awesome. A lack of dynamic capacity, but we can talk about that later.
Awesome. Thanks so much you could join us. Yeah, well, it's a government in action that you experienced, I guess, today. And Gabriela, floor is yours.
First of all, I love that you're bringing into conversation these two subjects, Rainer, like SDGs and creative bureaucracies, because I have the feeling from my experience working with cities that many times we think that it is a surface level thing, like how can we have new services, but it really actually entails a very deep rearticulation, both of the inner workings of government, as well as how government reaches out. And even I think the role that governments play within society. I think this pushes us actually for government to revisit first principles, and to once again start asking the big questions and functioning as an orchestrator of resources and citizen talent and all sorts of things. And in terms of the first principles, I think that government, once again, when in touch with the SDGs on a deeper level, like the dark matter or the deep culture of things, we need to go back to those questions of what type of societies do we want and how do we get there? And to Michelle's point, I do think that this entails going way beyond technocratic services. This is not about making services better. It does entail that, but efficiency for what precisely, So I do think that this brings us back into a conversation with political imagination and all sorts of things that have been left out of the policy government conversation. I also love the creative bureaucracies term because in many ways it sounds like an oxymoron. And I think that basically one of our missions should be that, yes, we create a language of paradox where we can hold the tensions between the creative side and the bureaucratic side, but that it doesn't sound almost ironic, or that's the reaction that many times I got when I told people I was chief creative officer for Mexico City. So how do we blend the best elements thinking about creative bureaucracy? Because on one hand, I think that we've found the world over that even though we would like to focus on innovation and creativity, when you see that there's all sorts of social movements and social energy that has no political articulation or no institutions to catch said energy, then things get dissipated. And we've seen everything from the Arab Spring to many social movements across Latin America. So I must say that I came out of my 6 years of government, having dedicated myself before that to arts and culture. So it was a very big jump with a renewed love, a very weird love actually for institutions, but perhaps of actually also having that first experiment and that first creativity be focused on how we're designing our institutions and how do we actually design institutions that also know how to shape shift along with the realities that we are now facing. Those dynamic capabilities that you have spoken about, which I think belong both to individuals, but also to whole coalitions. And in terms of the scale that I usually work in, which is the city scale, to the city itself. So I will offer a couple of provocations that I've been thinking about both in my time in the Mexico City government, as well as now that I've had the fortune of working with very bold mayors, such as the mayor of Seoul for 5 years on social innovation, and nowadays the mayor of Bogota, Claudia Lopez. And one of them is, bringing in the city scale into the conversation precisely, because I declare myself a daughter of the megalopolis. Like my big stubborn love is Mexico City. And I think that one of the really interesting things about localizing the SDGs within the city scale is that cities are actually great holders of complexity in many ways. And of course, we also know this whole conversation about the increasing urbanization of the world, where, repeated ad nauseum almost that in 2050, we'll have 70% of humanity living in cities, but places like Latin America have already reached and surpassed that 70%. So thinking about the city scale means also thinking about a potential scale of impact. But I think localization of the SDGs are not as easy as they sound. First of all, I see in terms of the metrics and much of the policy that has been created that we're not taking into account the tyranny of the averages, if you will. So I think that there's a component of spatial justice that needs to come in, of knowing that even if you take into account, let's say, the Gini coefficients of neighborhoods within Mexico City, to state one example, that look very, very much the same in terms of their challenges on paper. Once you land in Iztapalapa, which is one of the densest places of Mexico City with almost 2 million inhabitants, it's a very different context, even though the numbers are similar to Milpalta, which is a rural area within Mexico City. So how do we start really focusing on creating non-monolithic solutions, but being able to articulate a mission and a vision that entails and takes into consideration that we actually need to be quite nuanced in the way that we think of the challenges as they hit the ground, if you will, which this is why I think the localization of the SDGs and thinking about creative bureaucracies and local governments becomes incredibly interesting. On the other hand, I also think that in terms of cities, because of course, being a lover of cities and especially the very big cities, it seems, in many ways, I love the 11th SDG, which is about sustainable cities. But at the same time, I think we all realize that there's no way of siloing and separating any of them. Like, there's no way of thinking of gender equality without thinking of education or thinking about no poverty. All of these come as a package. And again, thinking at the city scale becomes really interesting to ask questions afresh. So since I'm in Bogota and in complete admiration of what the team here has been doing, so one of the questions that we're holding together, for example, is how does one re-articulate a city around care? This brings in care economies, and it brings in questions of the care burden, very much to Michelle's point about focusing less on efficiencies and more on well-being. In many ways, we have not taken into account in terms of how we do our GDPs and whatnot, the invisibilized, often non-remunerated work, especially of women, and how that actually intersects with other social needs, such as people with disabilities, senior citizens, children, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that one of the things that I've most admired about Bogota's question and centering care at a city level is that you have to reach deep into all of your system, and you actually have to re-articulate not only policy, but actually the way that government works to address all of these challenges in one fell swoop. So it's no good of thinking about, let's say, gender violence on one hand and economic burden on the other. Like, we really do have to have an intersectional glance and an intersectional posture, and that the way that government functions, the way that policy functions, the way that, let's say, social justice department articulates with the Secretary of Women's Affairs, who is leading the Care Blocks project here, is actually centering citizens and not centering bureaucracy, where I think the creativity of the word comes in. So I think that there's a really interesting possibility there when we go for mission-oriented cities, as Mariana Mazzucato, yourself, and the IIPP team would talk about, or what before running across you, we used to call in Mexico City visions for a megalopolis. Because this actually, when you have an urban imaginary, when you have a social mission, when you have an urban agenda, then you can start creating much more nuanced participatory scaffolding, which I think is needed, because I think we're still thinking of participation and coalition building in very simplistic ways, where I actually think that we need to start designing things to take on a life of their own, and where governments can actually take on a role of orchestrators and not only service providers, as I mentioned at the beginning. This is obviously more challenging than it sounds. But I do think that bringing into conversation a much more, again, nuanced idea of how we collaborate as citizens, of what it takes to articulate ourselves into a wider whole. And this is once again pointing towards the need that we actually do need political imagination. Like, we actually do need agendas that fire up the social public imagination of universities, of citizens on the ground, so that we're all working towards a wider, broader, public-based social mission that will, of course, need for new civic capabilities, not only government capabilities, which I also find such an interesting subject that I won't get into right now, but it's something that I've been deep in conversation here in Bogota that Latin America has an interesting legacy of that. And I have several others, but I think my 8 minutes are up, so I'll leave it at that and hopefully join in to more conversations.
Yeah, no. I mean, I just wanted to very quickly ask one specific question, and feel free to use this time also then to expand on your points. I think I find it very interesting, the idea of political imagination, because particularly when we talk about the concept of civil service or bureaucracy, even on the city level, there is still a very strong and rightfully so assumption of neutrality, that we have to serve the wider good and not only the political agendas of the day. So, but of course, political imagination is political also on a day-to-day level. So what is in your experience sort of bringing these sides together that, really on the level of organization, but also on the level of street level bureaucrats, people who work in these care systems. And so the political imagination and the need to stay in the middle of the road as a civil servant.
There's so many layers to your question, so I find it deliciously provocative. First of all, neutrality. I remember that one of my peers, the lab, I ran Laboratorio para la Ciudad, lab for the city, for 6 years as chief creative officer. And so most of my peers, no, actually all of my peers at the time were men all of the laboratories were based in first world countries. And so we were the first in an emerging country. I was the first one also to come from arts and culture, which is a very weird profile, I guess, for something like this. And I had so much input from some really amazing people that are dear colleagues up to this date. And I remember one particularly that exploded in my face quite quickly, which was a colleague of mine saying, Gabriela, don't get into politics. It's messy. Your job is to remain relatively neutral, because the moment that you enter the political sphere, which is particularly intense in Latin America, I must say, in that moment, you're going to waste a lot of energy on this layer of things. But then very quickly, I realized when I came into government that everything is political. I mean, the personal is political, and rather what we needed to do was wear an agenda, like our agenda on our sleeve, like really think about being clear about what type of city it was that we wanted. And fortunately, Mexico, since we have elected mayors since '97, has only and never been left-wing. So we travel at a different speed than the rest of the country and even the rest of the continent. One of the projects at the lab was crowdsourcing the Mexico City Constitution. So we already have up on constitutional level, both as in terms of political imagination, it's an interesting exercise. I think we rarely go into participatory processes that actually also entail thinking about the city that we want, the one that we've been, our DNA, but also the city that we want to become. And a constitution is an interesting point to your question, because a constitution is both a collective conversation about the city that we think we are and that we could be, but it is also a series of human rights that are the highest law that nowadays Mexico City has. So that became incredibly interesting, crowdsourcing the Mexico City Constitution, because we needed to do both. So in terms of up in the Constitution is everything from abortion rights, gay marriage, adoption by gay parents, euthanasia, transsexual rights, indigenous rights, cultural rights, there are notions of spatial justice. Like, it is a really interesting constitution in many ways. But to your point, in many ways, I have the feeling that we think that imaginaries, political imagination, urban imaginaries are the cherry on the cake. Narrative is a cherry on the cake, where actually that's historically the way that societies have made meaning. And for some weird reason, government, which is one of the biggest holders of those social imaginaries, again, like decided to have a technocratic turn where we thought it was only about efficiencies, but efficiencies for what? So bringing in back the political imagination conversation, the urban imaginaries, knowing that we need to deal not only with objective data, but also subjective realities, the way that mind anchors to reality, if you will, I think has to become part of the ongoing conversations going forward as we face increasingly volatile realities. So what will articulate diversity, and many times, let's say in an urban scape, in a place like Mexico City that is incredibly diverse, but also divisive in many ways. Many times the only thing that we have in common is the city and its future. So what does that actually mean to be able to articulate ourselves in terms of our diversity, but also our unity from there for the things that we do have in common, and a vision of a future, and hence political imagination is a cohesive factor within this.
Yeah. No, I think that's such a beautiful phrase, that the only thing we have in common is our future, and I think it's in many ways true as well, of course. And I think there is a interesting topic emerging from both you and Michelle, which is around what I would kind of call maybe activist bureaucracy in a good sense. That bringing in those, as you say, the civic values, the constitutional values, but then also actually carrying the political agenda in a good sense on the sleeve and being open about it. And I think that's a really interesting challenge. And I think this is where a lot of our institutions are struggling to find ways to actually express that, or provide civil servants to ways to actually do that in a meaningful way. As you know, in the UK, activist bureaucracy is a negative phrase currently by the government, who's sort of hunting down as it were, activist bureaucrats who are out for to get the Tories. But moving on, I think Aaron, if you're ready, we would come to you because you in many ways, of course, coming from and having been working in Singapore, which is a national government, but it's also really a city-state. So you probably bring together both worlds, but also, of course, now you're also bringing together the worlds of academia and civil servant. So yeah, over to you and for your perspective on this issue.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rainer, for having me. And I'm sorry I was late. I'm sorry for the slight airport surround sound that you might be hearing periodically, because I am literally in the Cafe Nero at Heathrow Airport, just after you exit immigration and baggage claim. But I was listening to Gabriella's sharing, and I think there's a lot of echoes and rhymes in the material I was hoping to share. Because I think a lot of us, we're moving in an interesting direction now, where the kinds of demands and expectations of bureaucracies, and also what we expect for citizens and businesses. I just wanted to share, in a sense, I was asking myself the question of, under the broad ambit of dynamic capabilities or acts of creativity for bureaucracies, what are the specific sets of skills that we would want to train in, right? And in terms of my current role at Oxford, what would we want to design executive education around? And when I was in Singapore, what were the skills we would expect of our civil servants, both at the very senior and the junior levels? And I kind of settled on 7 things, 7 really. I wanted to share what those were with you, so it should be perfect for 8 minutes if I spend about a minute on each of these. The first, and there's again lots of very interesting connections, I think, to what Gabriella was sharing. The first is what has increasingly been called futures thinking, right? The role of scenarios, of narratives, of storytelling, in the use of these stories to imagine possibilities, but also to use them as benchmarks for evaluating the assumptions and worldviews that we have today, and try and make better decisions in that whole process. Shell started and pioneered a lot of this effort. We certainly do a lot of it in Singapore. There are parts of the UK government and the Government Office of Science that do experiment with futures. And I think this is going to be a core skill that shouldn't just be a marginal thing that is done by a few people on the side. It needs to be a core way of being for most bureaucrats if they want to kind of articulate the imaginaries that Gabriella mentioned, but also really have a vision of where we would like to go, right? As governments and as societies, those governments actually end up serving. So futures is one critical aspect that I think is key, and that's thinking across time, if you like. A second aspect would be thinking across silos, thinking across disciplinary lines, across different sectors. And this, I think, is where the language of systems thinking and complexity starts to come to the fore. Again, something that pockets of governments have done, but I think we need to really find ways to mainstream this set of qualities and have them be parts of the literacies, numeracies, and core areas of expertise that any civil servant, or the vast majority of civil servants, should be expected to have. Hopefully elected officials as well, right? Not just those in the civil service or bureaucracy. Third, thinking across the human and technical interface. I think we need much stronger design thinking, design instincts amongst our bureaucrats. And this captures 2 aspects, I think. One, it captures the importance of really human-centered approaches, understanding the user needs. And that, I think, is where some of the care aspects that Gabriella mentioned would start to fit in, at least in my kind of schematic of these issues. But there's also the issue of the experimental mindset, right? The fact that we don't know what people are going to need until we A, talk to them, and B, test and prototype and have beta versions that we keep refining along the way. So that spirit of pivots, of iteration, and constant, coming up with lo-fi initial products that can be refined along the way, that I think is going to be a key aspect to bring in on as well, in order to actually overcome this human and technical interface. The third thing that I think we do need to have a lot more of is kind of a stronger vocabulary on morality and power. A lot of times bureaucracies tend to feel that they can function in a very technical, expertise-driven way. But the fact is, all bureaucrats are embedded in powers and systems of power structures, right? And so we need to have a much stronger understanding, I think, both of macro politics and power, but also the micro levels of this, right? The identity politics and intersectionalities that are emerging today and are seen as the causes of such anger and resentment in so many societies. Knowing how that, as a micro example, fits in with the macro examples of how parties are evolving, I think will make us much stronger as bureaucrats, because it helps us to understand who fears new moves, who are the risks going to affect, who are the losers from any ideas that we put out, and understanding those are important, I think, for us to then be able to calibrate what's in it for them, right, to come on board with this whole journey. So that's the aspect of morality and power. Number 5 is the issue of metaphor, right? I think we need to get a much stronger grip over the kinds of metaphors that we are using as bureaucrats, and then understand how those actually shape the very thinking that we have out there. And I say this partly because I write poetry in my free time, right? So for me, poetry and policy are connected very fundamentally. So again, Gabriella, I find that connection of the creative people that Raina's put together in this panel a really interesting one. Because if we understand our metaphors more, that I think is what creates the underpinning of the overall political and social imagination that we're trying to tap into. Anne-Marie Slaughter, in a really wonderful article, used some of the images from Internet 2.0, right? Government not as control tower, but and not even as a vending machine, but as a platform, increasingly. I think that sort of language is what we need to have a lot more of these days, right? And what does being the platform even involve? Right? It means governments are conveners, aggregators, facilitators, enablers of work, and not necessarily doers themselves. I love the ending of Mariana's latest book, where she says that in order to steer, the government must also row, right? And that's fundamentally using metaphors, right, in order to understand the roles that we have out there. And we also need better metaphors for what other parts of governance need to do, right? Businesses are not just regulated entities, but can they be partners in this whole process while managing the more capricious and rapacious aspects of their profit motivation? Can citizens be seen as active participants in the process and not just as passive receivers of policy that is decided on high? And all of that, I think, involves understanding that we all use metaphors, right? There's a language that drives the work that we're doing. And creativity means that we have to tap into language that is more generative, that is more in line with the life aspects and the life-giving aspects of this work, and not just the engineered, technocratic, mechanistic aspects of governance. So that's number 6, number 5, sorry, on metaphors, right? Number 6 links fundamentally to that, right? The issues of how do we, if we double click on this issue of citizens as participants, I think we get to the point where civil servants need a much stronger set of skills in not just stakeholder management, but in seeing citizens as active participants rather, in the deliberative and crowdsourcing processes that are inherent in government work. And this means that citizens have to be active agents, right? Not just receivers, as I mentioned earlier. But it involves a very different way of operating for governments. It means that we have to have much stronger skills of convening, of putting together open-ended questions, which we bring citizens on board into, as we're trying to find answers to them. And this links fundamentally to the kind of network governance, meta-governance literature that exists in public administration. But again, it cannot just be seen as the reaction to new public management. I think it needs to become a core aspect of what we do, and an aspect that really drives the central energies of how governments function. So that's 6 things. The last thing I wanted to end on is the issue of polarity thinking. I think that's going to be a core skill as well, because we have to find ways for governments to move across simple binaries, right, and realize that most of governing, especially as creative bureaucrats, is going to involve yes and answers rather than trying to figure out either or sides of extremes that we're trying to do. And we're seeing some of these polarities already, right? Gabriella mentioned holding tensions, right, between creativity and current delivery. And we need a lot more of that kind of tension holding, I think, in the work that we want to do. Governments have to optimize resources and be efficient, but they also have to be empathetic. They also have to be human-centered and experimental. And these will involve toggling both sides of these different polarities, like breathing, right? Because we breathe in and out at the same time. And we need to recognize that when creative bureaucracies are breathing, there will be times when we will move in one direction and other times we will oscillate in others. But across time, we will find that literacy, hopefully, to be able to hold those polarities in a constructive tension rather than a tension that drives us apart. I'll end off with just one quick observation, which is that I've mentioned these 7 things, but they really link with each other all the time, right? You can do design, crowdsource futures, and combine 3 aspects of that. Polarity thinking allows us to think about complexity in new ways. And all of this, as I mentioned, is underpinned by morality and power. And the more we find ways to find these 7 things interlocking much more strongly with each other, the better, I think, the overall work that we do as creative bureaucrats. Right. Thanks again, Raina. I'm looking forward to questions.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Yeah, very good, very concise overview of skills. And yeah, there are a number of questions, but I think I want to move first to Guy, and then we come back, and there's already some questions in the Q&A as well. And I forgot to ask Michelle and Kai whether you have any artistic background, because looking at it seems that Gabriella and Aaron have, so maybe you have as well. I don't know, but we'll get back to that. But Kai, you don't have any artistic background.
No, my hobby is bird watching, so it's nature. So
very interesting balance. All right, but the floor is yours now, Kai.
Okay, fine.
Your reflections.
Okay, well, thanks very much for having me, Raina. It's very interesting so far. I hope it will be continue while I'm talking. As I think Gabriella said, there's sometimes, I think most of the public think of the notion of an innovative bureaucracy is an oxymoron. But a lot of my experience is that the problem isn't so much the bureaucrats as it is the politicians. That they're often the ones who are much less creative. That, my, again, experience in dealing with bureaucrats is that there are always ideas bubbling up that often get shot down once they begin to deal with the political class. And so our colleague here at Pitt talks about democratic myopia, that politicians, for various reasons, are seemingly incapable of thinking about the future, or have a very hard time thinking beyond the next election. And so if we want to think about sort of future governing, which I think is really crucial and something we don't do enough thinking about, is how do we actually manage for the future? If we want to do the Native American notion of the 7 generations, then we've got to think that through better in terms of institutional design for the political class as much as for the politicians, okay? And secondly, a point that wasn't in my original notes, but Reiner raised it and it got raised again, is this notion of neutrality. Should the civil servant be a neutral? And I mean, this is a difficult question for democratic reasons. But I think in an age of populism, and when we're dealing with so much democratic backsliding, civil servants need to be non-neutral, but in terms of protecting the Constitution, protecting the liberal democratic values and the liberal policies that we all, I think, would subscribe to. So I think the notion of them of the neutral Weberian bureaucrat who simply does what he or she is told probably doesn't hold very well anymore, both for the reasons of developing a more experimental, a more innovative bureaucracy, but also for political reasons, for maintaining the liberal democratic state. And while we're speaking of states, I think Michelle's comments initially lead me to bring up something. I'm writing a book now, typical academic notion, on the inclusive state. And the notion here is that in sort of beginning with the existing welfare state ideas, which have certainly done their bit for society, but also tend to be exclusive. They tend to leave a lot of people out, and also tend in some ways to exacerbate inequality as much as remedying it. And actually, I got into this with the Korean Institute of Public Administration, who did a big project on this, and had even more indicators of inclusiveness than there are indicators of the SDGs. So so I think it's an interesting way maybe to approach some of these ideas about transformation and dealing with the current challenges, is thinking about inclusion as one of the sort of central concepts. So now let me move on here. See, I think we also need to think about, and so I think Aaron sort of implied this or said it, that we need to think about moving beyond simply thinking about bureaucracy as part of this, and we need to think about bureaucracy. What we're really dealing with here are governance problems that are much broader than merely the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy may be a key player, and it's certainly important, but it's by no means alone. And what we need then to understand is governance of these issues as much as actually the role that each individual actor plays. And therefore, we need to think about institutions that are beyond the usual sort of brass plaque institutions of parliament, prime minister, bureaucracy, and think about more informal institutions that link all these actors together. And as also been implied, we need to think about these things, I think, more in design terms. Now, I've written a lot about policy design, institutional design. And if we relate it back to the SDGs, for example, designing new design would want to go beyond the label. So we have 17 nice little silos that have been created that replicate the structure of many governments, which is fine up to a point. But the problems are cross-cutting. The problems don't stay within the silos. Likewise, the instruments that we need to use don't, and again, we need to build institutions of intervention. So the stuff I write on policy design, sort of basically say that for design, we need a model of the problem, a model of the instruments we use, a model of intervention. Again, how do you build the institutions to do this? And then finally, a model of evaluation. What values are we attempting to maximize as we go through this process of governing? And I focused a lot on thinking of these points about the SDGs. And just a few comments there. And it's probably fairly banal by now, but I think the important thing to think about is that they're really problems at two levels. One is the level of the individual goal, one of the 17. The complexity of within each. How do you make decisions that are really dealing with very difficult collective action problems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's also then the question of the collection of problems. That is, we have 17, at least 17. And the way in which they're framed, initially at least, is that there's no prioritization. So what's most important? What do we do first? There's no sequencing. Maybe we need to do some things first and some things second, some things third. There's really not much linkage among them. I had a Brazilian graduate student who was working on the SDGs as they impacted a small, very poor community near Brasilia. And what he was finding was because of where his grant money came from, he was focusing in on health, but then he understood, as fairly obvious, how this connected to everything else and how he couldn't really contain thinking about health. And likewise, health couldn't contain itself. It was influenced by all these others. And so I think then we need to think in terms of solutions. So within the stovepipes, that is within the 17 silos, stovepipes, whatever one wants to call them, thinking about governance complexes rather than bureaucracies, thinking about linkages between the political, the stakeholders, the people, and the bureaucracies around the problems, and developing, again, informal institutions. And that, again, that sounds like another oxymoron, I realize, but we live with informal institutions all the time. So developing these stable patterns of interaction that can work and be creative within the individual systems, within individual problem areas. But also, I think increasingly important, as one of the things I've always been sort of fascinated with in government is the problem of coordination and coherence across the system. So how to think about creating then greater coordination, greater coherence across the system. So there's a wonderful woman, Ruth Hubbard, who was president of the Civil Service Commission of Canada some years ago, who talked about what she wanted to build was a virtual government. And so that they would be the stovepipes, but only up to a certain point of technical experts. Then above those would be essentially a cadre of expert managers and policymakers who would come together in different configurations to solve particular problems. And then those configurations would dissolve and go on to the next problem. So thinking about ways then of not getting locking ourselves into the stovepipes, into the silos. And likewise, some of my practical experience working as an advisor to the Prime Minister and Ministry of Finance in Finland, we developed a system really of matrix government there where the Prime Minister could impose his or her priorities across the system while maintaining the ongoing functions of government. So I guess my final point about the SDG is just sort of I don't know what, throwaway comment. was it struck me that the whole system is designed to fail. I'm looking at the last report from the UN on the SDGs, very little progress in most of the SDGs in terms of actually getting to where we want to get. And so by having set hard goals and clear indicators, which are what NPM, among other management tools, tells us to do, we've designed a system that's almost bound to fail. So we need to learn the virtues of ambiguity. And I'm sort of tempted to think of Senator Aiken during the Vietnam War. Senator Aiken from Vermont said that the United States should have declared victory and left. And maybe we should do the same thing with the SDGs. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Guy. Yeah, that's a very interesting take on SDGs. But I think we can all agree on that if you set those hard goals, it's very difficult actually to manage towards them, particularly as the life tends to be much more complex than those siloed goals. So there are some questions in the chat, but I actually wanted to, sort of from listening to all of you, wanted to bring some of the questions, or one or two questions to all of you, sort of back into the round, as it were, before we go to the audiences. So I can also ask from the audience. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat, and we'll get to you. So I think I have like 3 questions, let's say, and each of you can answer as many as you like, pretty much. So first of all, I'm really interested in this idea of what do we value. And I think Michelle talked about that, Guy, and everybody talked about that. But I think there was specifically, we also mentioned a couple of times the indigenous or native values, and there's decolonizing aspects to that. I think I would like to, if you want to sort of speak to that aspect, how do we actually bring these kind of, and I think, Kai, your new book about inclusive state, I think it very much speaks to that. As you mentioned, that even the idea of a welfare state, of course, has exclusionary practices, and in some ways, the history of bureaucracy is about exclusionary practices because it's the history of expertise. And how do you get expertise? Well, you go to school, but not everybody can go to school. So I think there's already like an exclusionary practices baked into the idea of bureaucracy. So how do we actually bridge that gap through decolonizing inclusive lenses? What are the actually really interesting examples or practices you can think of and bring here? Because I think that is really challenging, but it's also a difficult area as well to discuss. So I think it's interesting. So I think the second question, I think both Aaron and Kai, you already sort of implied, because what I'm really interested in is when we talk about those new skills, and particularly this ambiguity and uncertainty, and managing that and working that in that space, but also this overtly more activist, being fine with being non-neutral, I think, which is again something that, if you go through a civil service test, you have to sort of fake being neutral, I guess, and there's all this kind of really interesting challenge. But I think, what are the implications for organizations? Are there, I think governance implications, I think Kai, you made very interestingly clear, and these experimental ways of having teams to focus on problems rather than silos. But I think also from your own practice or your academic work, you can speak to what kind of organizational implications you see. Are we building, or are we trying to build slightly different kinds of organizations? Maybe actually we need diversity of organizations in public sector. Maybe this sort of idea of 20th century that everything is one civil service, everything is, which has its virtues, obviously, but maybe actually now we should consciously build organizational diversity to have some organizations that are much more open to risks and can also fail, and others that are sort of much more routine based and so on and so forth. So I, again, would like to hear your opinion to that. And my final question is around what would you teach on a public administration course? Because if I look at the typical public administration programs around the world, you still see very much the microeconomics, policy analysis, welfare economics. So all of the things that we have discussed and you have brought to this discussion, wonderful points. And I think I agree with those points. It's very rare to find them on public administration agendas, also executive education agendas. So I think my question to you as well is where would you start from changing those agendas as well? And so yeah, maybe we come to you, Michelle. So you can pick and choose any of those questions you want to answer, and we in whatever order.
So I guess your first question about values, I think is resonates with the work that I've been doing, and and how do you look to to honour Indigenous values, or to bring in Indigenous values, especially in a dominant paradigm, which is, as we spoke about, based on efficiency. And I think it's really complicated, and I think one of the most important things is not to assimilate or to codify values, and so to really honour. So in New Zealand, the tax working group has worked with tangata whenua and academics and come up with a tikanga framework, which is an Indigenous framework, which is quite surprising for something that would come out of a tax working group. But it's great because it's kind of stepping into this, and so I can share that link, and we've used it in some of the Productivity Commission work, and others are using it, and it's been gifted as a way of broadening the conversation and talking about more holistic or interconnected values. But it's challenging because it makes you have to stand in a place where you're happy to acknowledge that that we're borrowing the earth from the future, so it really does focus on kaitiakitanga or stewardship, and really gets into kind of challenging you to think about property rights and what that means, and so I think it is complicated, but there are ways of doing it, but you have to be genuine about doing it, and that's the difficult bit. That's the bit. It's one thing to hold a framework or to kind of to speak to something that you intend to do, but how you embed it, and I think what was discussed before is the kind of polarity in the political economy, and that starts to play out, and you encounter a lot of the status quo barriers, and I think, as Rowan Conway talks about, the immune response. So a lot of the work that I've done over the last few years, you really do kind of run up against that immune response if you're trying to create change. But I think everyone holds values, but a lot of people hold them implicitly. So I think that's what I said before. If you can kind of interrogate the system, or you can interrogate the values and make them more explicit, and then stand in that awkward place where you're happy to kind of confront that, then I think that's how you kind of move forward. Yeah, and I think back to your question about, what should we teach? I think for me, it's curiosity, and it's pluralism, right? It's kind of multidisciplinary. It's kind of also looking at science, and it's kind of bringing through young people into the system that are confident or brave to challenge and to ask questions. And I think, I'm not sure how you do that. Is that design, or is that kind of strategy, or whatever? But it's actually kind of empowering people to have curiosity, I think is an important thing that I think is missing a bit. And it comes back to your point around what does creativity mean, and and how do you create a creative bureaucracy? I think you have to be prepared for it to be able to explore.
Excellent. Thank you, Gabriela. And you can again pick and choose whichever question you want.
I will pick and choose and riff off of some of the things that your questions provoked.
Sure.
First of all, in terms of public value, I do think that it's an interesting conversation to have nowadays of centering value once again, because, as Oscar Wilde said, a cynic is the one that knows the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And I think we've been dedicating so much of our time to costs and metrics that can be important. Again, they do have their place, but that is not the be all and end all. And we have, I think, been optimizing for efficiencies instead of asking efficiencies for what. In terms of the centering other systems of knowledge, next week, actually, it's another reason why I'm in Colombia. I will start an advisory role as well with Vice President of Colombia, who's Francia Marquez, who's a fabulous woman with such an interesting trajectory. Talk about political imagination and embodied political imagination. She started off as an activist at age 13. She's the first Afro-Colombian to come into such high power, which is incredibly important symbolically, as well as in terms of the realities that it can create in all of Latin America. She was also a domestic worker recently. So there are so many things that she symbolizes. And she's also been a land defender and went head to head with Canadian mining companies here. So in a certain sense, having her as vice president of a country, and to be honest, I'm super honored to be accompanying this process, which will also be based on the national care system. And I think it's interesting, some interesting questions are starting to surface even before we begin, since she has been very much focused in terms of Afro-Indigenous and Indigenous communities here in Colombia. First of all, there's a question of, in terms of care, but I think that this can be extrapolated to so many things. How does one create a scaffolding and infrastructure that allows for the role of the state to be a lot more capacious in many ways? Like, how do we have a space for public policy, but how do we also take into account different systems of knowledges? Because many of the indigenous communities from Colombia actually have deep knowledge and deep historic practice of how they actually think about care on a community level, and in really interesting ways, because, you know, when we think about care in the first world context, many times we think about care as an individual responsibility instead of a collective capacity. We think of care as spending instead of an investment. So what does this infrastructure look like that allows for a civic response as well, for a community response that is also based on pluriversal values, if you will, as Arturo Escobar would say, like, you know, unity with diversity, or what Guy was calling coherence of the system, but that also allows for things to take on their own texture, their own forms. And then what does that even mean? First of all, because I think that the whole thing of bringing in mutual aid has many times to divest the state from its responsibilities and leave that resilience to communities, where I think that that's actually not the answer going forward. But how can we bring in new ways of thinking, for example, of policy that takes into account the possibility of what in Spanish is called alianzas público-populares, that the closest thing that I can come up with off the top of my mind right now are popular public community focused alliances, where there is a role for the state, there is funding, there is resources, but there is also agency and autonomy and this principle of unity through diversity that is so much part of indigenous knowledge systems. I think there's really big questions there, because talking about participatory scaffolding, how, and the transdisciplinary edge, which is also one of the things that I'm completely enamored with that Aaron was speaking about. How do we make different knowledge systems speak to each other? How do we have a role both for deep technical expertise, but also historical cultural knowledges? In terms of urban imaginaries and political imagination that I forgot to mention, policy many times doesn't want to get into the messy human heart part of the equation, but legal frameworks are not enough. We actually need to enact social change and cultural shifts. So how does this all get taken into account in terms of these different knowledges that might not speak in the same way to different communities, which is what the whole of Latin America is composed from. So I do think that, you know, policy has been very much dedicated to thinking of human rights as a universal access, but one size fits all is actually not enough, we're starting to see. So do we need new paradigms to think about something that is, again, like pluriversal in nature, that yes, there is unity, but there's also diversity. Then in terms of very quickly, the new skill sets, I actually think besides creative bureaucrats, we also need acrobats. So I think that we're going to have to learn while we fall in many ways. And falling and I think the acrobatic and improvisation, actually, I think we need to be prepared. And I think this is not only a government skill, but a social skill that we're going to need going towards the future. What are the capacities that we need to develop as people, as individuals, as well as a society, that will allow for us to react in the best way to whatever comes up that we're not going to know? So what does that even mean in terms of capacities? And again, like, I think that even on a personal level, and I think one of them is actually going to be really focusing on social articulations of what does it mean to act collectively, and knowing that we're not going to fare very well if we act as an individuals going forward. So those social structuring skills will once again come to the foreground. And then last but not least, in terms of teaching, once I get back to London, I'm going to have like a big 2-day powwow with Rowan Conway, who is my co-pilot. And we will have all sorts of interesting new experiments to be done in terms of the pedagogies to accompany all of this, because this is actually, I think, one of the biggest challenges. Like, let's say, even in terms of transdisciplinary practices, as I was telling my students this last trimester, it is the everything, everywhere, all at once. So how does one teach for this? How does one teach for emergence? How does one teach the experimental, when basically it really will be mission focused and from very specific things that we can't necessarily have a generic version of.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. So Aaron, you can also pick and choose from the 3 questions.
I wanted to start with the issue of indigenous values, and I loved Michelle's answer. I thought that was fantastic. I just came from Greece, actually, where I was interacting with a whole bunch of young Obama leadership fellows, and a number were from New Zealand and shared similar examples to what you did. And I just wanted to say one thing, which is that I think in addition to the values themselves, I think we can also learn a lot from the methods of indigenous communities. We can learn to them as individuals. I think there are really interesting processes around tribal deliberations, around the core aspects of recognizing the intrinsic humanity of individuals. That kind of, and you get this from Africa as well, right, with the notion of Ubuntu. I think there's a lot of there that we can try, both in terms of values as well as methods. And I thought it was worth mentioning this, Rainer, because I know you asked us about values, but I think there are actual modalities and specific things that we can try. And then just quickly on neutrality, right? I actually don't think civil servants can be neutral. We are impartial, yes. We are non-partisan. Yes, we work for whichever party happens to be there in power in the day, assuming we come from electoral systems. But I don't think we're neutral. We can't be, right? We serve the government of the day, first of all. So in that sense, we're already not neutral. But we also serve a country's long-term interests, and we cannot be neutral to that, I think. So I do think there are other words we can use, like non-partisan, impartial, objective, hopefully evidence-based, where that is possible and evidence is available. But I don't think we can afford to actually be non-neutral. And I think we need to actually make it clear to our politicians that if they ask us to do things that are, unobjective and not useful to a country's long interest, it is our job to push back on them. And it's certainly what I would do. I mean, I may not do it in a big, giant public meeting, right? But I will have a word with my minister and say, are you sure you want me to do this? And then kind of outline what the consequences might look like. And then finally, the agendas for training, right? I think I love that question. I think you're right. We are far more, in most systems, we are focused far too much on micro and macroeconomics. I think we need to be much more integrated in terms of the disciplines that we draw on. And that has to include science as well. I mean, it cannot just be a social science and humanities education that we provide. We need bureaucrats who are literate consumers of scientific information. So that's one aspect that I think we need to have. I agree completely with Gabriella that we need to learn as we fall. I think we also need to learn from the falling. Once it's been done, right? I mean, just think of failure as a teaching experience and a learning process, and teach citizens to understand that, right, rather than simply see it as something that they react against in a negative way. And just one last thought on this. I think we need to think a lot more, not just about training. You talked about training and education, right? The word I like to use on this is the French word formation, right? When they talk about education and training, they talk about formation. And it's formation not just of the head, but the whole person, right? The heart, the hands, the ability to execute and deliver. And I said this to a lot of the folks in my new role at the School of Government in Oxford, because I think that we need to not only engage the head, we have to think about how we form whole persons who are resilient, who are dogged in the work that they're doing, and who are able to learn as they fall, learn while they fall, learn from their falling, and actually build on that whole process. Because those are all issues of character, right? They are usual eulogy virtues, not resume virtues, to use the words of David Brooks. And we need to find ways to actually start building that up in the same way that the French notion of formation actually has done. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. And Kai, floor is over to you now.
Okay,
pick and
quickly,
choose.
we're running out of time. I think quickly on the first question about the indigenous values, etc. I think all, as everyone's been saying, it's important to bring those in. But I think the other thing we need to think is almost to think about the other side too, is that the problem certainly in American politics and government now is not that we don't recognize diversity, is that essentially we're fighting over diversity. That essentially identity politics has just completely shattered the system and shattered trust within the system. So at the same time, we need to think about the diversity. We also need to think about the unity. And certainly, as I said here, right now, the unity is at least as big a problem. Secondly, I think the point you were raising about organizations, clearly not all, you can't have the cookie cutter bureaucracy sort of style of designing organizations. But I think in fairness, we actually haven't done that. I mean, I think we tend to see big cabinet ministries as sort of the model and sort of a nice hierarchical, bureaucracy. But if you look around government, there are an awful lot of innovative, small, non-traditional organizations, corporations, foundations, etc. And then there's what Harold Seidman called the twilight zone of government. These things that exist between the formal and the informal, that then are crucial for really making the system work, and particularly working in arts, sciences, social policy. And then I had the experience of actually running a undergraduate program in public policy for 5 years, which was great fun. And we had all the, they had to take economics, they had to take statistics, but they took the form of statistics that's based upon imperfect knowledge. So if you look at the standard regression model that most people learn, it's based on as if you have a full information, a nice data, neat data set. But there are a variety of methods that can deal with the same questions, but deal with much shakier data. And I think that's often what we're faced with in the real world of governing, is often very shaky, incomplete data. Okay, we also they had to take ethics, they had to take sociology, and then they had to take 3 courses in a substantive area. I think it's something that Aaron was saying about, in science or in engineering or whatever. So they had to have a substantive field as well. So it's not just policy; it's policy about something. I think that was all. What was the third question? I'll stop. Never mind.
No, that was the third question. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Perfect. Yeah, so we are indeed running to. We have pretty much 9 minutes left, I think, and there's a time has come by, and I think I have written down, and there's like a number of questions in the chat, so we have to pretty much actually hone in on one question, I think. And I was wondering whether, because what I find really fascinating is that we have been talking almost 80 minutes about future bureaucracy, and we haven't mentioned digital at all, which I think is really it's a very good thing, actually. So we can talk about bureaucracy without mentioning digital government, perhaps because there are some of the key underlying issues that are maybe more important than what goes on in the digital space. But I actually want to still give you the chance to sort of bring in, if you think there are lessons to be learned from digital transformation in government, or there are other areas of government as well. So this is one question you can tackle if you want to. And I find very interesting. I think that I think all of you, I think Kai explicitly, but others maybe implicitly, sort of talk about this informality as well, in informal institutions, informal, communities of practice, as it were, but also, of course, bringing in people who are not typically in government. I think Gabriela talked about that. So I think the informality, how do you manage that, I think is something that I'm really interested in as well, because again, this is something you are in a twilight in many ways, and this twilight is, of course, is not very easy to be as a civil servant, because you might be punished for that, you take risks and things like that. So the informal institutions, informal communities, their role, and what is your experience, and the digital transformation, the lesson from that. I think that's pretty much it. So maybe do we start this time from Aaron? Maybe to mix it up a bit.
Sure. I was texting Rainer earlier to say that part of the reason I was as late as I was is because the digital gantry that I normally use to get through the passport control in the UK wasn't working. So I had to go talk to a human this time, and that took extra long because there was 15 Japanese 12-year-olds in front of me, clearly coming here for a summer holiday. Very cute, but it took a lot of time. And I share this because I then asked someone a question. I said, this digital thing worked 2 weeks ago when I traveled back from the US. So do you know why it might not be working today? And then they told me, oh, it's because it's really crowded today. And I laughed because the whole point of digital is that it works when you have a crowd, right? So that you ease the crowd rather than make it worse. And I mentioned that only because I do think digital has huge transformative potential, and Raina and I have had many conversations about this, but I am more and more coming around to the belief that digital only reinforces what is already there. If you have an empowered, intelligent bureaucracy, that is what gets empowered and it becomes better. If you have a forward-looking, futures-oriented bureaucracy, digital will make that better. And if you have a really hierarchical, directive-driven bureaucracy, then that is what will get reinforced. And an unempowered bureaucracy where they tell you things like it's crowded, therefore this thing isn't working, that is what will then perpetuate with digital as well. So I think it's entirely right, Rainer, that we have focused on those other more fundamental things, because the digital is only going to work with what's already there rather than necessarily transform it. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Gabriela, let's come to you next.
No, I also appreciate that we didn't take a digital first turn to the conversation, because I think, the digital has so much potential in terms of new ways of being able to articulate and amplify the social that we didn't necessarily have before digital means came in. And at the same time, I think that talking about the importance of metaphor, to Aaron's point, and how that actually is not surface, but actually structures our belief systems and hence our social realities. This whole idea of city as computer, for example, in terms of the urban scale, I think has done so much harm, because we do start thinking about things under a computational terms. And then we think that the digital can substitute other experimentation and innovation. So I think the digital is there to complement it, but not ever to substitute it. And I lived in the Netherlands for a year and a half during the pandemic. And it was really interesting for me to read some weeks ago that one of the biggest supermarket chains inaugurated like a little experiment where they now have a slow lane. And it was so successful that now they're rolling it out in 200 supermarkets. So the slow lane is actually when you want to talk to the cashier and have a chat, which is both brilliant and beautiful and tragic, because imagine getting your social burst, if you will, at the supermarket for 5 minutes instead of 1. But I think that leads to this whole ease of click society is actually getting us into a place where loneliness is becoming a pandemic. It has pandemic implications almost in terms of the size and the cost that it entails for society, both in health, in terms of what it means to be able to articulate as a society for democratic purposes, for example. What does it mean to think about those tensions within the diverse societies that we are, to be able to have spaces that are face-to-face, to be honest, where we can actually work our way into a common understanding within this diversity that we coexist in.
Great. Let's come to you, Guy, and then Michelle, you get the last word as the early riser here.
Well, I agree with a lot of what's been said, but I think the other point to raise about this is that the digital government, e-government, whatever you wants to call it, can also be exclusionary. That if you don't have good internet access, if you are afraid of computers, if you're old like me and most of my co-age people, can't use it. Won't use it. So if we begin to rely so much on that, I think the system becomes even more exclusionary than it already is. This came out very strongly in education, I think, during the pandemic. The kids who lived where there was good internet, who had parents who were tech savvy, etc., did fine. Lots of others didn't. So I think we need to think not just about the technology, but also about, again, the social connections.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think probably in 10 years, we'll see social media as smoking, as harmful as smoking. So, but anyway, Michelle, last word is over to you.
The only thing I have to really add on that is on that point that Guy raised. It's on exclusionary, and what you can see is actually the amplification of inequality and power imbalances as well. So digital kind of assumes access or assumes understanding, which is not always the right assumption. So I guess it's how do we embrace digitalization in a way that doesn't amplify inequality and is inclusionary, I think, is one of the key bits. So
awesome. So we have been managing our time very well. We are exactly at the end, and it was very, very fast. I can only thank you very, very much for everybody on the panel. It was fantastic. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think we could have we could have gone on for a few more hours and dig deeper into some of those areas, and I hope we get to do that. I know that Michelle is finishing the report for her commission. This will be public. Kai is finishing the book. So and I think we'll hear from Gabriella and Aaron as well very soon. So everybody, thanks for joining, and look out for these people and their publications coming out. This is very, very interesting. And thanks everybody for joining. Michelle, Gabriella, Aaron, Kai. Thank you very much. And
for having us.
Take care. Bye-bye.
have a good day
Bye.
Thanks.
or good evening.
Bye.
Bye.